Hello and welcome to the next episode of my tutorial series, Keyboard and Theory Basics on Synthesizers. So far we've covered quite a lot about the basics of music theory and the keyboard. We've named the notes, we've talked about intervals, we've talked about rhythms, we've talked about scales, the circle of fifths, and improvisation and using chromatics and various other topics. So finally, we're going to get onto chords. That's to say, in all the episodes up to this point, we've only been playing one note at a time on a monophonic synthesizer. So today, we're going to experiment playing more than one note at a time. We're going to be using the Sonicware Liven 8-bit warps as our simple subtractive synth, and as we've been using recently, the Volca drum to provide any sort of rhythm or percussion that we need. So first, let's recap scales. Now, I've explained how scales can be constructed from the circle of fifths. I've explained how some notes in a scale might be stronger or weaker harmonically in that scale. I've explained how the chromatics work around them. So let's jump to a scale we're very familiar with, C major. Oh, this sound is very boring. Let's try and update it. Okay, sounds a little bit better now. So, scales. Specifically, let's start with the C major scale. So, think about the scale, think about the notes, think about the intervals. So what exactly is a chord? Well, normally when we think of an interval, we think of two notes played one after the other. What a chord is where an interval, or the notes in that interval, are played simultaneously. If it's only two notes, we call it a diad, technically not a chord. So, diads, they have a more interesting sound than playing one note at a time, but they don't necessarily imply a tonality in the way that a chord does. So what do I mean by that? Well, when talking about scales, we've discussed major scales, minor scales, and other modal scales. When you think of a chord can be thought of as a selection of notes taken from a scale. And in fact, any chord is harmonically compatible with any scale that contains all of the notes in that chord. It can be used with other scales as well, but typically that's how we look at them. So let's play our first chord as an example, the chord that pretty much everyone will have heard before, the C major chord. So in the same way as the major scale has a slightly upbeat, positive sound to it, the C major scale has a comparable sound. Equally, we can make a C minor chord. So you can hear that that has a more downbeat sound. These chords are made of 3 notes. We can make chords with more notes than that if we wish to as well. They're usually called extended chords. So while that was a C minor chord, this is a C minor 7, C minor 9, C minor 11. So I'm not going to introduce extended chords here, but hopefully it's clear that chords are not limited to triads. But one of the reasons why we introduce triads is a triad is the simplest chord in terms of having the smallest number of notes that we can use. And secondly, and more importantly, it introduces easily the concept of diatonic chords. So I have previously referred to these 7-note scales sometimes as diatonic scales. So the diatonic scales such as C major scale, we can create chords from those scales by picking every second note from that scale, starting at a root, the root being the name we give the chord. So this chord starts with a C, and I build up from it. That is a C chord, and you can hear the tonality, C major. Let me start on the D, skip one, play, skip one, play. Minor tonality, E minor, major tonality, F major, major tonality, G major, minor tonality, A minor. Something different about that one. Let's look at the intervals. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So notice that in all the other cases, the upper note actually sat on a fifth. In the case of the B chord that we got here, it actually sat on the flattened fifth, or the tritone as it's also known. That tonality is known as a diminished chord. So what did we get? Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. So starting at each one of the notes in a major scale, skipping every other note, we can play a series of chords which we call the diatonic triads of that scale, and the pattern they occur, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, is repeated in all such scales. Now, since we know that there are relative scales to this scale, you can imagine, because they use the same notes, if we're just playing every second note, then the chords are going to be the same chords. But since the root is different, when we think about them in terms of the scale, they start differently in that sequence. So if we start on A, that's minor, so we have A minor, B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor. So now we can think that in every minor scale, the order, the tonality of the triads, the diatonic triads, going up the tones in the scale are minor, diminished, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor. In the same way as we could look at how the other modal scales related, for example, to figuring out what the pentatonic scales would be correspondingly, we can do the same thing to find the tonalities of those diatonic triads in any of our modal scales. I'm not going to go through that process for now, but it's relatively straightforward, but it's also relatively instructive. Now, if we were to play the chords only in that arrangement, play a note, skip a note, play a note, skip a note, play one more, we would produce sounds which were not very interesting when we move between the chords. So for example, so you hear that I hear all the notes moving up and all notes moving down parallel to one another. This movement of the individual notes that make up a chord are typically called voice motion. And the way you can think about that is, imagine that each one of the notes in the chord were a melody being sung independently. Which note we hear each one of these notes move to is the voice leading that's happening there. It's the motion of that voice. So when I go from C major, G major, F major, C major, I listen to the bottom note, or next note, next note up. So they all have the same sort of motion, and all those motions run in parallel. And all in all, it sounds kind of boring. So how do we avoid that boring sound? Well, the answer is in voicing. So you may remember that I mentioned that when we play a note, say C, which C on the keyboard I play, they are functionally equivalent. So look at this. C major. Now let's take this C and let's play the C up there. Let's move this G and play it up there. So in both cases, I just played the same C major chord, but you could hear the character of that chord was rather different. And that choice of placing those notes and potentially repeating them, like I could have two Cs, I could have two Gs and one E, that choice is known as the voicing of the chord. Now, a complete understanding of chord voicing is relatively complicated, and we're not going to go into full detail of that, but we will describe one method of voicing chords. And that method is known as inversion. An inversion is the easiest to understand way of revoicing a chord. What is an inversion? Well, when we play the chords, starting with the root notes, and then having, in this case, we skip a note, play one, skip a note, play one. Once we have made that choice, if we take the lowest notes and play it an octave above instead, that is known as the first inversion. If we take the second note and play it an octave above, that's known as the second inversion. So we have root position, first inversion, second inversion. Where is the third inversion, you say? Well, there are only three notes, so the third inversion is root position. So we have this way of playing it, this way of playing it, this way of playing it. Why would we choose one over the other? Well, firstly, they sound different. So if I finished playing this versus if I finished playing this, you could imagine that that would have a different feel in the context of a song. But just as important, or even more importantly, is the voice leading. So consider the C chord. Imagine I started with my C major in root position. And now I wanted to jump to the G chord. So here's the G. But look how far all of these notes have moved away from where they were. And note how that D there is actually could be played down here. And then it's adjacent to these notes. And that B there could be played down here. So this, if you think about how the G chord looks, is effectively the first inversion, but I'm playing an octave below. So now listen to this. This is C root position, G root position, C root position, G first inversion. I'm sure you can hear that mentally you're hearing as one of the voices, as another voice, and as the other voice. So we have a very comfortable motion of each of the voices in the chord. That is a nice way of leading the voices. So let's now look at that F chord. So since my chord progression is running, my sequence of chords, C, G, F, when I voice this F chord, when I invert the F chord, I want it ideally to be close to my C chord and close to my G chord. So what options have I got? Well, I could just jump up, I could jump down, doesn't sound very good. I could also play it in the first inversion and then jump back up. Not too bad actually. Or I could choose a different inversion for the F. So an option that I might choose is my F, I might pick first inversion, second inversion. So let's try it. C root position, G first inversion, F second inversion, C root position. So in this case, when I think about where my notes moved, where have they moved? So the upper note played this, and then it repeats. very gentle motion. Let's look at where the middle note moves. So. Gentle motion. Again, let's look at the lowest note. So what have we got? So a very gentle motion of the chord. So when we listen to the progression, we feel comfortable with the chords. And we feel comfortable with the motion of the notes within those chords. So why do we care about diatonic chords? Well, the reason we care about them is because the diatonic triads of a scale are harmonically compatible with the notes in the scale. Why? Because I said any scale containing all the notes of a chord are compatible with that chord. Well, given that these chords are made from notes from the scale, we can guarantee compatibility. They're not the only ones that are compatible. So for example, G chord could also be compatible with a G major scale, of which that could be a chord. I could play those notes against this chord. In practice, you usually wouldn't in an improvisational context. Unless you are quite an experienced player, you would probably stick to the root key of the song as opposed to following the chords. So I think I've spoken enough about chords. I will try and demonstrate playing some chords. Maybe I'll play in C minor instead of C major. I might play some slightly broader voicings, but I'm not going to play a melody. I'm just going to play chords. So let's get a beat going and play. Okay, so I played some chords. I didn't really pay attention to what I was playing, so some of those may have been larger chords than just triads. Some of them were triads with repeated notes in the voicings. But importantly, all of the chords were made up of scale tones. The chords were either diatonic triads or extensions of those triads, and they were all made only of scale tones, meaning that if someone were playing a melody, especially if it were in C minor pentatonic, every note that they chose would have been compatible with those chords that I played. I'm not going to speak too much about choosing chords to play. A lot of this is aesthetic choice as much as it is music theoretic choice. So don't get too fixated on exactly what notes are correct, exactly what chords are correct, but understand when you are deviating from conventional vocabulary musically, and understand why you're doing that, as opposed to randomly trying to find notes to play. So I think that is it for today. I hope you found this useful. I hope the series has been interesting. I hope you join me for some more of my videos, especially the next episode in this series. But in any case, I'd like to say thank you for watching and goodbye.